Good afternoon, because now after 12, it's afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Karin Goldmark. I'm the Deputy Chancellor for School Planning and Development at the New York City Department of Education. And I have had many roles in my life. I was a teacher. I went to law school. I worked for a deputy chancellor. I ran a college access program. I was a senior education advisor in the mayor's office. And in addition to all of those roles, I am a yoga teacher. So in the spirit of sustainable development and wellness for all of us, I'm going to start from that role and invite all of you to just put your feet flat on the floor. And just show of hands, how many of you have ever been to a yoga class before? Well, a lot. Yes, I'm always amazed there aren't more guys in yoga classes because it's mostly women in spandex. We're stretching, we're relaxed, and we're always actually happy to see guys in the class. And so don't be afraid if you haven't been. It's actually a very welcoming environment. So if your feet are flat on the floor, then I invite you to just sit up tall. You don't have to physically find your spine, but with your attention, find your spine and just sit up a little taller without stretching way out of your hips. You can just find that a little more alignment in your spine. While you're all really good at this, I'm wondering if we have some former military people in the room because some of the postures are so good. Yeah, great. And I invite you now to take 5 breaths. Just your own breaths, whatever they are, deep or shallow, and just count them. Great. There's an organizational development expert at MIT named Otto Scharmer, and he has this whole theory about leadership, and it boils down to this. The internal coherence, the internal mind frame of the person who's making the decision is actually the most important thing. Not actually the decision you make, not how fast you have to make it, but that actually how centered and present we are when we're going about our work is actually the most important factor. And some days I find that to be true, and other days I struggle. But that's one way to approach the work as we think about sustainable development. So in New York, we have many architectural and cultural attractions. This is the Freedom Tower. We have Broadway and some amazing musicals, including Hamilton, which is my personal favorite, even though it costs an unbelievable amount of money, it is worth it. The Empire State Building, things you've all seen. The Statue of Liberty means so much for our whole country, so much for the city, and millions of people, including many of my own ancestors, passed through New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty on their way in. We have the largest pre-K program not only in the country, but in the world. We are actually the world's largest provider of pre-K, just by the numbers. We have about 70,000 students in pre-K. We're now adding 20,000 students in 3K. Just massive scale. We also have Elmo, and this is perhaps not the Elmo that your children are used to. This is a shot of Times Square, and in Times Square we have folks who dress up as characters and usually are very polite, but if you have seen some videos of the Times Square characters maybe not being so polite, there are some videos out there of Elmo maybe landing a few punches. We're friendly in the beginning and then sometimes a challenge, and then we have some other notable residents of New York, like Pizza Rat. If you saw this video, this was a very enterprising rat in the subway. I just want to note this rat is not a picture of a rat in a school. This is a rat who took an entire slice of pizza down an entire flight of stairs out of dedication to his family, I don't know. Or her family. And actually, I did think that this might be a group of people who can relate to the challenge, at least in the big city systems, of some of the challenges we have around pest control, where I need to give a big shout out to our facilities team because through a sustained effort, we've actually been able to significantly reduce rat infestations near schools by having rat-proof containers and putting our waste out at a time that's much more aligned to pickup, which is the work of my colleague from the Division of School Facilities, John Shea, and maybe those of you who were here a couple of years ago heard from Meredith, who runs sustainability. Anyway, let's keep moving, but that's one of the things New York City is known for, and of course the Yankees. Okay, an overview of our school system. As a city, we have 8.5 million people. 800 languages are spoken in New York City, almost all of them in the New York City schools. We have 1.1 million public school children, and to put that in perspective, that means that today, as we speak, 1 in 300 Americans is sitting in a New York City classroom. And many of you probably know someone who grew up in New York City, or you yourself grew up in New York City. New York City is an engine of people coming through and moving through to other parts of the country. So most of the people who grow up in New York will end up living somewhere else. And maybe those of you who have adult children, many of us, our kids, will want to live in New York. So it tends to be a city that people move through a lot. There's a lot of mobility in the school system and the city as a whole. We have 1,800 schools, 1,325 buildings, and 114,000 students who last year experienced homelessness. So tremendous challenges, tremendous opportunities. There are over 300 New York City school buildings that are 100 years old, and I want to talk about that in a minute when we talk about sustainability, just in terms of how we're doing, because obviously the facilities are really the base. Our graduation rate is almost 76%. Our college readiness of the graduates, 67%. And at this point, we've reached the highest number so far of students who are enrolling in college after graduation. It's almost 60%. So essentially now in New York City, if you see somebody who looks like they are between 18 and 21 years old, you can assume that they're in college. And what that means for the university system is that they are having their own facility strains because so many more of our students are graduating and going on to college. So it's a nice problem to have. It is a challenge from the facilities point of view. And we are thrilled with these numbers, and we'd like them to be even higher. And I will just note, nationally, that is the trend. Our young people have listened to us when we've been saying, you need to go to college, you need to have post-secondary training. They're listening to us. They're graduating in record numbers. They're going on to college in record numbers. And how we support them through that is one of our challenges as a society and is part of what we're hearing in a lot of the debate around college tuition. So just starting from this 7th-generation principle, which is, it comes from the Haudenosaunee, which is actually the traditional correct name for the group of people who are sometimes referred to as Iroquois, which is, Haudenosaunee translates as the people of the Longhouse, people who were native to New York State. And this principle is that in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. And so for those of us who work in facilities, this is literally true, because we have buildings in New York City that were built 7 generations ago, and there are children in them today. And you are building buildings in your districts that will be used 7 generations from now. So in addition to the sustainability challenge of how we build in a way that actually supports our ecosystem being healthy 7 generations from now, it is very possible that you are literally managing buildings and building buildings that will be used 7 generations from now. And I just want to say that I have found, sorry, I'm going to go back for a minute. I found that we can have 2 buildings with an identical design, because in New York City in the 1890s, we had, over the space of 40 years, there were 20 million people who came into the United States, the vast majority of them through New York City. And so we built buildings that looked exactly the same in different communities. We would put up, it was called an H building, because from the top it looks like an H, or it was a U building, and you can walk into those buildings and you know where the principal's office is, and you know where the cafeteria is, because the buildings are laid out the exact same way. But in some cases, those buildings have terrible heat. It's cold in one part and it's hot in another. The windows are stuck. The building just doesn't work. The wiring breaks all the time. And in other cases, those buildings, same age, same exact design, they purr like a cat. They're great buildings. And I've been trying to figure out why is that? Is it maintenance? Is it that at the original construction, one building was built by a contractor who stayed that extra 10 minutes to make sure that whatever bolt they were working on was tightened right? Is it some contractors didn't care as much? What is the difference between two identical buildings in the same city operating so differently 100 years later? And when we think about sustainability, part of it is the work that we do. Every piece of work you do has its impact today, absolutely, for the children in front of us, but just think of it as having those ripples years and years down the line, because it really does. Those of us who work with buildings that are old know that they're not all the same. And in our case, some of them literally are the same. They are the same design, but they don't end up operating the same way because of some decision that somebody made 120 years ago. So in our every deliberation, we must consider that impact as we make those decisions, to defer the maintenance or not, to find a way to invest in the maintenance that has been deferred prior to us. All of those decisions, these are long-term decisions. We're basically a group of long-term planners, long-term workers. Chancellor Carranza came to New York about 20 months ago, and he immediately went out into the community and started listening, because he was new to New York. He'd been in 4 different school districts. And he listened to the community. He visited hundreds of schools, talked to thousands of people. And then he came back to his cabinet and he said, I've heard a couple of things. Here's what I've heard. I've heard that we need to accelerate learning and instruction. I've heard that we need to partner with communities, because truth be told, the DA, we had a terrible history of how we partnered. We would basically tell people what was going to happen, and then we would make it happen whether they liked it or not. And he said, we're going to develop people. So across the organization now, we have efforts to really develop our team. And those of us who work on the operations and facilities side of schools, we can often be neglected. But when organization-wide there's a focus on developing people, then our teams also get attention. And all of that is undergirded by this effort to advance equity now. Now, how many of you have had dialogues about equity in your school districts? It's a very big word in education now. Yes, I'm seeing some hands. So it's a really big word. It's a buzzword, but what does it mean? So I recently came across a definition of equity that I like a lot. And this is it. The idea is that if your identity did not predict in a statistical sense how you fared in the world, that's equity. Equity is not everybody getting the same thing. Equity is not the school system providing absolutely everything that each person needs, because I'm not aware of the school system, even in what is arguably a very wealthy city in New York City. Even in New York City, we can't do that, even with historic investments in capital planning as we've had over the last 8 years. But it's until we can look our students in the eye and say that I know that your outcomes do not depend on who you are. It depends only on what you do, depends only on your work, it depends only on your effort. It depends only on the set of skills and talents that you naturally have that have been developed over time by you and with educators. That's what equity is about. It is not about battles between different cultural and racial and ethnic groups or genders. It's about getting to a place where how people do, the playing field is actually fair, it's actually level. So we can't ignore that piece of what equity is when we're talking about it. What's important to remember is we want to be able to look every student in the eye and say, you have odds that work for you, and they're not at the expense of someone else. And that can lead to really difficult conversations in the work about the reality of where we are now. It's important to have those conversations, and I don't think there's anybody in this room, or really in any room when we talk about it this way, that would disagree with this goal. So what does that mean in action? It means investing. In New York City, it means we have the largest capital plan we've ever had, including a $750 million investment in accessibility. a $750 million investment in technology, which some of you heard me describe earlier, investing in adding 57,000 new seats to address overcrowding in New York City schools. Chancellor Carranza always says, show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are. So in our capital plan, we've prioritized accessibility upgrades to existing schools, because it used to be the case that school districts in New York, we are divided into school districts, sub-districts. Areas of New York City that had overcrowding had accessible schools because we built them since ADA. And areas of the city that were underutilized did not have accessible schools because we weren't building schools in the areas that were underutilized. However, that means that if you're a family and you live in an area where the schools are underutilized, you have to travel far, in some cases, to get to an accessible school. So instead of saying, well, I'm sorry, you just have to be on a bus for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, what we decided to do was invest in accessibility for existing schools. And we did this with advocates, we did it with community, and then we got a lot of thanks from the community because we did it together with them in terms of developing the initiative. In technology, we had a situation where our bandwidth just was not anywhere near up to where it needed to be for what we demand of students and teachers, for that matter. So we upgraded the total amount of data in our system. We crossed over to fully fiber optic network for distributing that data, and we refreshed the technology in each school, and we're now doing the refresh on a 5-year cycle so that no school has network infrastructure that's more than 5 years old in the school. And in terms of new capacity, 57,000 seats sounds like a lot. It is a lot. It means we're building all the time. It also means that we still, at the end of this capital plan, we'll have sub-districts that are still overcrowded, because we have so many communities where we have 130%, 140% utilization. But we are bending the arc on overcrowding, because that is one form of inequity. If you have no art room, no science room, because you need those for classrooms, that's a challenge in terms of fairness. So here's an example of creativity, because New York City doesn't have a lot of space. This is in downtown Manhattan. This is Spruce Street School. It's actually the school that my 7th grader goes to and has since pre-K. This is a building that's an example of the kind of projects we're starting to do in more and more places in New York, mixed use. So you can see the bottom 5 stories is a nice traditional looking brick school building, and then rising out of it is a 75-story titanium-clad luxury rental apartment building designed by Frank Gehry. And we don't get money from the rent for that building, but we do have some projects where we do. We have an entity called the Education Construction Fund, where when it's built on city land, we have a mechanism for doing a mixed-use development where we will issue bonds that pay for the construction of the school, and in partnership with a private developer, essentially, the private developer will pay us rent that's equal to amount of our interest on the bonds. And actually, Jennifer Maldonado is here. She runs the Education Construction Fund. It's not always easy to make a project like that go, but when we do it, we're able to get a school that essentially costs us 0 capital dollars because we have a mechanism to pay for that. And I would encourage you to speak to Jennifer if you think that's something that might work for the economics of where you are. In a lot of districts across the country, you have all the space you need, and the issue is around the bond financing. For us, we have kind of the opposite challenge. We do not have space. Most things in New York already have something on it. It's pretty rare we find an empty site. In this case, this was a parking lot that belonged to a hospital, and through a convoluted process, we were able to get a school in the bottom, and then this crazy rental tower. You can see the cafeteria picture here. Beautiful new structures. So one of the things that we've started to do differently, and I mentioned this earlier, is planning with communities. The old approach, we would develop a proposal, we would engage the community, and then we would endure however much pushback there was from the community, hoping to still get our original proposal through. What we do now is we partner with communities. We ask communities what they want to see. And I just want to note, this is for educational model design as well as for building design. We're not asking the community to design a school, but we're asking the community what they want to see in a school. We then develop options. And then we seek input from the community to figure out what the feedback is on the options. And sometimes just holding the public hearing doesn't work so well. And what we need to do is really need to go out into the community. We've knocked on doors, we've gone to coffee klatches, we've gone to community organizations that host dinners for us where we go ask for input. And then we present those best options and we try to converge on a consensus. And this requires a lot more effort, a lot more time. It's not necessarily easy at the front end, but we end up with better support for our proposals. And in cases where that involves consolidating schools or merging schools or taking actions that communities traditionally don't like to do, this allows us to have the honest conversation with communities about the capacity needs or the overcapacity, and to develop that together so that the community doesn't feel like we're taking something away, and instead we're together looking at problems and solving them. And that relates to sustainability, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of having that proposal work in a way that ameliorates the education in the community. Because if we just tell a community we have to merge these two schools, we have to close this school, people will feel like we are doing an injustice to the community. If we together face problems together and say, look, we know that we need to serve your child better, your child needs an art program, your child needs a music program, how do we get to the place where we can do that from a budget perspective, from a sustainable budget perspective? It's an honest conversation. It's not an easy conversation, but it's a much better conversation because we're all having it together. We're also doing this with respect to educational design, where we've invited communities to put together design teams to create new schools and to reimagine existing schools. So everything we're doing is with partnering with communities, because it takes longer, but in the long haul, schools work better that way, facilities work better that way. This is a picture of our first net zero energy school in New York City. It's currently our only one. And it is an elementary school in Staten Island. For those of you who know New York, Staten Island is the place in New York City that has the most space. It looks more like the suburbs than most parts of New York City. And so we were able to do solar panels kind of across the whole building and make the building take up more space than we normally are able to work with. So it allowed us to create a net zero energy building. But the truth is that none of us is actually doing enough on this issue. So all of what we're trying to do is mitigation, is baby steps. We have an initiative to put solar roofs on as many schools as can actually support it, because we have some schools that have nice big flat roofs. And even if we do 50 of those in a year, it'll be another quarter century before we have them on every roof in New York City. So the challenges that we face around sustainability are so deep, and the need for change is so great, it can lead us to feel some despair. And this brings me to my next quote, which is from a psychiatrist who worked on developing models that work for helping relieve post-traumatic stress disorder. And the notion that the lies we tell ourselves is our greatest source of suffering always brings me to this question of what are the lies we tell ourselves? And those lies tend to be more along the lines of limits on our own capacity, limits on our own expectations, limits on our sense of what is possible than on anything else. So if you find yourself thinking, I will never be able to get my board to go for this, or I won't be able to make this change in the direction of sustainability until this other thing happens, or I just don't have the energy to take on this challenge right now, or our budget can't support this work, I would challenge you to just question yourself of whether that's really true or not. And while it may feel true in the moment, one of the things that we can always do is put our feet flat on the floor, straighten up our spine, and just allow the possibility that maybe a new option, a new opportunity, a new pathway will emerge. All we have to do is believe that it's possible. We don't have to know how it's going to work. None of us know how it's going to work to bring all American schools to a place where they are sustainable, where they're aligned ecologically, where they're all net zero energy. No one knows how we're going to do this. But just allowing ourselves to believe that it's possible might be enough to get us started. So just for some inspirations from notable New York City public school graduates. We've got some Supreme Court justices. We've got some Nobel laureates, in case you're wondering who Sidney Verba is. Alicia Keys, the wonderful musician. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Somewhere in your schools, there's a Nobel laureate. There's a Supreme Court justice. There's a great artist. There's a great scientist. There's somebody who's going to invent a solution to a problem we don't even know we have yet. And so when we're thinking about working with that principle of 7 generations forward, you don't know if it's this generation. It could be actually 3 generations from now that that president or musician or scientist is going to be in the school that you're working on now to either maintain it or build it or design it. So you think about it as some amazing person and all the amazing people who are going to go through that building that you're working on in some way. And keeping at the center this question of sustainability, that we don't know how to do it now, and that's okay. We should do the things we do know how to do and allow the possibility to exist for the things that we don't yet know how to do. So I'll leave you with one more quote from Mary McLeod Bethune, who said that the progress of the world will call for the best that all of us have to give. And so in that spirit, as the yoga teacher that I am, I think that's usually the best that I have to give. I invite you to do again that sitting up straight, the feet flat on the floor, and thinking of something that you have done in the past year, the best that you gave in this past year in your job. You did something amazing. I know you did. You don't have to tell us what it is. You can just think what it was. And then knowing that whatever that best that you have to give for this next year hasn't been given yet, and looking forward to that amazing thing, the best that you have to give, that will happen sometime in the next year. Thank you so much.